Number, the Lark Between Two Shadows. Number, Chapter 1. A video with no sound. The video began with a woman in a fluttering blue dress, standing on a pier at dusk, a gull's cry slicing the air as if to open the scene like a can. The sky over Greyhallow Harbor darkened by increments, blues bruising into purple, and the wind played the dress into a bird that could not quite lift. Everyone who watched the video said the same thing. They leaned in, as if their eyes could become hands. The comments trailed beneath in a delirious river. What happened next? Why is there no sound? Who filmed this? And the fewer answers I gave, the more they clicked. I had not intended for my life to become something people binge-watched between midnight and sleep. I used to make wedding highlight reels, cinematic footage of rings and flowers, and soft-focus vows. But then Julian died in Greyhallow, and my camera, like some devout instrument, would no longer record anything that did not have the scent of truth on it. On screen, the woman's hair whipped across her mouth like a veil. She lifted her hand and traced the empty air over the water, as if she were conducting a symphony only she could hear. In the background, the lighthouse grinned with teeth of light. The camera followed her. The frame was unsteady, but not careless. Whoever filmed the video knew how to keep her centered. The edges wavered while she remained the still point. She turned once, looked directly at the lens, at me, at you, at the thousands in the dark, with their thumbs paused above their screens, and her eyes were the color of a storm deciding whether to break. And then the screen cut to black. There was no sound. There had never been sound. The upload glitched, they said. You muted it, the others accused. I swore up and down that the original had gone quiet like the sea just before a body disappears. People told me silence is dishonest in a medium built to scream. I told them the truth, which is that silence is where the story went to hide. I watched that video on the train as it thrashed its way along the coast toward Greyhallow. Beside me, a fisherman with hands stained the deep brown of coffee slept with his mouth open, a paperback face down on his chest. Across the aisle sat a woman in a red coat whose lipstick bled into the cracks at the corners of her mouth, the color of an intention that had changed its mind halfway through. The rhythmic clatter of the tracks knitted me to the present. Miles to go. An empty backpack with a camera that had seen too much. A notebook with a name written on the first page in a hand I couldn't recognize. A storm was due, according to the conductor and the app. In an hour, the town would be soaked. Greyhallow was famous for fog and the lighthouse that pierced it, for a chowder so thick you could stand a spoon up in it, and for a tragedy 30 years old that had never finished sinking. I was not there for chowder. I was there for the woman in the blue dress on the pier and the silence that came down like snow in July. When Julian first told me about Greyhallow, we were lying on the roof of our apartment building, eating take-out noodles out of the carton, letting our breath fog the late March air. He was a sound designer for independent films, one of those rare people who believed sound was not the frosting but the cake. He'd once spent 3 weeks collecting recordings of winter rain in 5 different neighborhoods just to decide which one sounded most like loneliness. Greyhallow has an echo, he said, eyes on the sky. A real one. The cliffs shape it. If you stand on the harbor steps just after sunset, it sends your voice back to you so sincerely you can't help but tell the truth. You think my voice can't tell the truth already? I teased. He laughed then, low. The kind of laugh that made you believe in your own best versions. I think all voices lie a little, he said, and we tossed noodles into each other's mouths like kids. 2 months later, while I was filming a quinceañera in Glendale and coaxing a grandmother onto the dance floor, Julian drowned off the Greyhallow pier. He had told me he was going for a sound. He promised to record the echo. They found his body 2 days later under the pilings, seaweed draped like silk over his face. No foul play, the officer had said on the phone after they identified him. No note either. Sometimes the water just takes. I didn't go to the pier then. I couldn't. I packed my cameras into their padded holsters and developed a hatred for music. I went quiet for a while. The quietness was a cliff. I stood on it and waved to the air. No one waved back, but the silence did not bite me as I expected. It wrapped around me the way my grandmother's quilt had when I was small, full of old fabrics and stories that made no sense to anyone else. And then, months later, a video appeared on my phone. It was an airdrop from an unknown sender at a film festival. I almost declined it. My thumb hovered. Something made me accept. I watched a woman in a blue dress on a pier, and even without sound I could hear how the wind would have sounded, how the gull would have broken the quiet with its blade of a voice. I could hear the sea run its fingertips across the shore. I could hear the cello of the lighthouse's foghorn, although the weather in the video had been clear. At the end, when the screen went black, something rattled in my stomach like a pitcher with a crack in it. There was a figure in the last frame, a figure I didn't notice the first dozen times. A man with his back to the camera, shoulders squared, a distinctive glint at his right ear, silver, circular, a ring in his cartilage that I knew because I had once hooked my finger in it when we kissed, Julian. Or a man with his ear, or the ghost of a choice made elsewhere. So I booked a ticket to Greyhallow. I told my YouTube subscribers that I was going to make a film about love, loss, and the sound of silence. They clicked because they always click when a heartbreak is dressed in a new dress. I called the project The Lark Between Two Shadows because I had dreamed of a lark trapped in a room with 2 doors and no windows. The first door opened to a bright, whistling meadow with an owl in it. The second door opened to the same meadow without the owl. The lark didn't know which door led to a song and which to silence. She had to choose. The train pulled into Greyhallow Station, which was less a station than a polite clearing with a bench. The air smelled of ropes and things that had been wet recently. The storm had not yet broken. The town was a puzzle of shingles and salt-stained windows. The lighthouse on the headland wore its beam like a scarf. I felt the nudge of grief and stood still, letting it pass through the way a wave will pass through when you dive under at just the right time. My phone pinged. A message from an unknown number, ***, we need to talk. Pier, sunset, come alone. Bring the video, ***. I looked up. It was afternoon. Greyhallow's sunset was notorious for the way it turned the water to old coins. I could go to my rented room at the Anchor Inn, unload, find my shoulders again, or I could obey the imperative of narratives and go straight to the pier, because strangers who text from nowhere mean danger, and danger means ratings, and ratings mean that some part of the pain will pay for itself. I tightened my scarf and walked. Greyhallow's main street was a thin, earnest strip of businesses. A bakery that had run out of croissants before noon, a thrift store where a mother held up a sequined dress and looked at her daughter with hope, a diner whose sign read "Eat Fish" in letters that looked like fish. The Anchor Inn was a boxy 2-story building with a porch that had not been repaired since the last hurricane. A brindled cat watched me from beneath a wicker chair, and an older woman with wrists full of bracelets welded from beach glass handed me a key. "You're the film girl?" she said. Not a question. "I am," I said, "because I do not know how to lie unless the subject is myself." "You'll want a room that can hear the foghorn," she said, and gave me 2B. "People who come here for sound always do." The room overlooked the harbor. The bedspread was the color of a fried egg. I dropped my backpack onto the chair, opened the window, and heard the town. The gulls were not knives now. They were laughter. Someone shouted to a friend about traps and lines. A radio down on the dock played a song I once danced to at a teenage homecoming, a song that would sound corny and merciless if I listened too closely. I took the camera out like a confession. Its weight steadied me. I erased the notification badges from my phone, as if I were smoothing the surface of a lake, and then I went down to the pier. The wind had begun to practice for the storm. It rehearsed at half volume, as if not wanting to blow its voice before the show. The pier boards creaked under my feet like an old man telling a joke. The lighthouse's beams swept like a metronome across a darkening score. People stood with their backs to each other, as people do couples placing their heads in converging angles, teenagers contorting their bodies for photographs as if they had invented bodies and were testing the patents. No one spoke to me. I have a face people ignore when they need to believe they are alone. At the end of the pier, a man leaned on the rail and watched the place the sea stop pretending to be a friend. He wore a dark coat with a collar turned up and had that stance particular to the grieving, a posture that looks exactly like waiting, but is not. He turned when I approached, and the first thing I saw was the earring, not a ring, but a small silver bar, glinting in the wind's scatterlight. Despite myself, I saw Julian standing in our kitchen, making a martini he didn't even like, just for the sound of the ice shattering inside the glass and saying, "Sound is a room you can walk into and shut behind you." "Quiet," the man said, saying my name as if he had first said it in his head. I nodded. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. "Adrian," he said, offering a hand. "Adrian Vale." He saw my eyes drift to the earring and tucked his hair behind his ear, a reflex so gentle I felt it like a brush. "Julian and I work together. He smiled then, a break in the cloud. "I'm not him. But he used to tell me he wanted to introduce us. He said you would like me. He said you had a way of hearing what you couldn't see. There are those moments when your life hands you a prop you haven't rehearsed with." I held out my hand, and he took it. His palm was warm, and I felt something vibrate between us. Not supernatural, not even romantic indentation before weight, the way a place in your couch remembers you after you stand up. He had the kind of handsome that comes from meticulous neglect. A few days' beard, a mouth that had not asked for forgiveness recently but knew it might. "You texted me," I said. "I did," he said. "Walk?" "Embers." We walked, which is to say, we placed our feet into the wind's mouth and let it speak syllables of salt around our ankles. Adrian led me off the main pier, down the smaller set of steps Julian had once mentioned, where the harbor's echo might be coaxed into performance if asked politely. The boards here were slick. I kept my camera close to my chest in case the wood changed its mind about supporting me. At the bottom of the steps, Adrian stopped. The water licked at the pilings like a cat tasting cream. He gestured to the horizon, which had become a boundary between two moods. "Do you have the video?" I nodded and found it on my phone. The woman in the blue dress unfolded again on my screen, her hair a translating flag, the lighthouse slicing its attention across the frame. Adrian watched with the expression of a man listening to a story about himself with characters he had never met. At the point where the man with the silver glint in his ear appeared, he touched the screen with his thumb to stop it. "There," he said, "that's me." The wind agreed too loudly. "You filmed it?" I asked. "No," he said. "I haven't filmed anything in months. I've been—" He groped for a word and came up with one that did not fit but did not protest. "Detangling." He let go of the screen. "But that's me. I was there that night." "What night?" "And we tense. The night before Julian died. I could feel my blood making decisions without me." "He drowned the day after." Adrian nodded, eyes on the water. "We were recording. The echo. He wanted an empty harbor so the sound would be clean. We stayed late. We drank after. He said some things. I said others. And then I left him where this stair meets the pier." He pointed with the hand that was not mine to hold. He said he'd be right behind me. "And you didn't," I began. But the rest of the sentence was an accusation that could not be formed without my voice going shrill. Adrian held up a hand. "I went back," he said. He was gone. "The water is fast here at the turn. It doesn't look it, but it is." "And the woman in the blue dress?" He closed his eyes, and for a second he looked like a man being held underwater in a memory. "That's Ilara," he said. "She's—" He shook his head. "She's a singer. She used to stand here and sing into the echo just to see whether it would return her voice less lonely. She said the echo lied less than people did. She was there that night too." "Ilara," I repeated. The name snapped a match in my head. When I had woken 2 nights after Julian's funeral, I had dreamed of a name written in sea glass on a table. Asterisk, asterisk, Ilara, asterisk, asterisk. I had dismissed it as grief being a show-off. Adrian looked down at my phone. "There's no sound," he said, as if I had stolen something. "There was a song. The kind you can't forget even when you should. Where did the sound go?" "I don't know," I said. "It wasn't there when I received it." "How did you receive it?" "Airdrop," I said. "At a film festival. Unknown sender." He smiled without his mouth moving. "There are no unknown senders," he said quietly. "Only people not yet known." He handed the phone back. The lighthouse's sweep struck his face and took pieces of it with me as it left scraps of cheekbone, the line from lip to chin. I put the phone away because suddenly I felt that allowing him to watch the video had been like taking off a shirt in a kitchen full of knives. "Why did you ask me to come alone?" I asked. "What is it you need to tell me that doesn't want witnesses?" Adrian took a breath that the wind took too much of. "He wasn't recording the echo for a film," he said. "Or not only for a film. He was recording it for you. He wanted to build you a room you could walk into. He wanted to fill it with a sound that told the truth." "That sounds like Julian," I said, and then heard the past tense as it fell. "There's more," Adrian said. He tucked his hands into his coat as if to keep them from signaling the wrong things. "The night he died," he said, the echo had begun sending back something else. Not his voice. He glanced at the sky, which had decided to weep a little. A confession, but not his. The first raindrops were fat enough to be individuals. They landed on the boards with the sincerity of men who have no idea how to flirt. The people up on the main pier began to pull their jackets around their lives and retreat toward the diner and the inn. The gulls lifted and moved sideways, which I always admire in birds. The lighthouse's beam grew thicker, as if the rain made it tangible. "What confession?" I asked. The word sat hot on my tongue. Adrian looked at me then, and it was like a door opening onto a room I recognized from a dream I had never admitted out loud. He said the echo sent back your voice, he said, and that it told him you'd left before you did. I thought, ah, what a convenient cruelty grief is, that you can be accused by a place you've never been. You're misremembering, I said, and my voice tried to climb a ladder while wearing the wrong shoes. Grief edits tapes. You know that. You work with sound. He nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that I had spoken. He stepped closer, not close enough to be a threat, close enough to be a kindness. He told me something else, he said. He told me that if anything happened to him, I should find you. He said I'd be able to tell you something he couldn't. What? That Ilara wasn't singing to the echo. She was singing to him. There are many ways to be faithful that are not monogamy. There are many ways to betray that have nothing to do with where bodies sleep. I felt a hollowness open between my shoulder blades, the premonition of wings or emptiness. I couldn't tell. What do you want from me? I asked. A companion in doubt? A woman to hate for you? An audience? I want your video, he said. Not to keep, to hear. I have gear. I can try to retrieve the sound. If it's there, I'll find it. If it was taken, I may be able to pull the absence into shape, like plaster in a mold. He held my gaze, and I saw in it the kind of devotion that is indistinguishable from a plea. If the echo said your name, I want to know why. If it didn't, I want to help you prove it. Everything in me that loved narrative screamed to let him. Everything in me that loved the truth shrank. I stepped back so the rain could find my face. I had always loved rain. It's such an earnest liar pretends to be awash is actually a record. Where water goes, it writes. I'll think about it, I said. He nodded. I'm at 4C, anchor in, he said. Knock any time. If you decide against it, I won't ask again. We climbed the slick stairs in parallel. Not companions, not yet adversaries. Two people in a drawing that did not know its shading. At the top, a woman in a blue dress stood under the diner's awning, arms folded, a cigarette making calligraphy in the air. She looked at us with a gaze that had learned contempt and found it a poor shelter. Her hair, dark and slick with rain, clung to her shoulders as if refusing to be defeated by gravity. Ilara, Adrian said softly. She flicked the cigarette into a puddle with the precision of a shot. Don't bring her into it, she said, voice low, too measured to be rage. If the echo could have worked through rain, it would have brought the word back. Asterisk, asterisk, her asterisk, asterisk. I'm already in it, I said. I am not brave, but I am stubborn. Ilara studied me, eyes moving over my face like a thief, deciding which window to jimmy. You're the one who made the silent film, she said. The mourner's influencer. I didn't make it, I said. I only found it. Same difference, she said. A bitter music the wind carried in its teeth. Everything we find, we make something out of. She looked at Adrian then, an old tenderness honored and dismissed in the same motion. You shouldn't stand down there in a storm, she said to him. You'll catch a cold. To me, you'll catch something else. If I want to talk to you, I said, will you let me? No, she said, but I'll sing for you. That's all I do for strangers. She stepped away from the awning, and the rain applauded her. She walked past us without a flinch, shoes exact on wet boards, and disappeared into the curtain of water like a line erased. I turned to say something to Adrian that would be clever enough to protect me. He had already gone. A ghost of a man was left in the rain, but it was only a trick of the lighthouse's beam. I stood alone on the pier then, camera heavy against my ribs, as the storm performed its first act. Back at the Anchor Inn, the cat had given birth to 2 kittens under the lobby's music stand. The woman with the glass bracelets crouched by them, humming a song older than the town. I climbed the stairs to 2B, changed into dry clothes, and opened my notebook. On the first page, the name ***, Elara ***, shimmered where I had written it in a hand that could not be mine. Maybe I had risen in some half-sleep and written the word. Maybe someone had tried to make my life more interesting. I touched the ink. It had dried long before my body arrived in this room. It's a funny thing to feel pursued by something you have not yet admitted you want. I wanted the sound. I wanted the room Julian had promised. I wanted, in a way I could not confess to the camera or the comments, for the silence to tell me what I had said when I was alone. I took the drive from my bag. I watched the video again. When the woman in blue turned toward the camera, I paused and studied her face. There are people who can make their eyes do more than see. Hers did. She was not pretty. Not exactly. She was hungry. She was asking for something without permission. She looked at me and then past me. I remembered what Adrian had said. She sings to the echo because it lies less than people do. When the screen went black, I kept watching. People always stop when there is nothing to see, but absence, too, has frames. In the blackness, I heard the storm begin to lift its skirt around the lighthouse. I heard my heart miscount. I heard something else, deeper, like the thunk of a door closing somewhere on the other side of the building. When I lifted my eyes to the room, the window had fogged with breath I could not have made alone. On the glass, in a circle about the size of a hand, a patch had cleared as if someone had wiped it with the heel of their palm to look out. Beyond, in the rain, a figure stood, no coat, no umbrella, its face turned up to the lighthouse's sweep. The beam found it and bound it for a second, then it was gone. I stood. I did not move to the window. I did not turn on the light. I made a choice that felt like refusing a dare issued by the part of me I liked least. I sat down and wrote in my notebook, ***, tomorrow. Steps at sunset, record everything, speak my name, ask for his, ***. I kept the camera on the bed beside me, the way a child keeps a flashlight. When sleep came, it did not knock. It crept in, lay down, and shaped itself to me. In a dream, I stood at the harbor steps and said my name into the echo. It returned, my voice altered, as if my mouth had moved at a slightly different time than my mind. It said my name and then a word I could not catch, lost at the moment of waking, dissolved like sugar. All that remained was the taste of something that needed to be chased. In the morning, I would decide whether to knock on 4C and give Adrian the video. In the morning, I would search for Elara, not to ask, but to listen. In the morning, the kittens downstairs would have opened their eyes and thought they had invented light. For now, Greyhallow's storm shouldered the building, and I thought of Julian with his ear to the wood, listening for something we had all agreed to pretend was not there, and I thought of the silence that falls when you finally tell the truth. Chapter 2. The Echo Room. I woke to a lighthouse heartbeat. The beam must have struck the window just so, because my eyelids warmed and cooled in a rhythm that synced with a dream I could not keep. For a moment I had the strange conviction that I had slept with my head beneath water, lungs doing the ancient math of survival, while my body posed as a buoy. The storm had washed the town clean. The air coming through the slightly open window smelled like lemon rind and rope. Downstairs, one of the kittens was arguing softly with the world. I showered fast, dressed like a person who might be filmed without warning, black jeans, sweater, a jacket that made me look less breakable than I felt, and slipped the camera into its holster. When I went down to the lobby, the woman with the bracelets was knitting with string that looked suspiciously like it had once tied up a bundle of newspapers. "You sleep?" she asked without looking up. "Like a rock that dreamed of flying," I said. She nodded, as if that were an expected answer. Storm took some shingles, but not our courage. Coffee? I accepted a chipped mug and drank something so strong I could imagine it walk into town on its own 2 feet. The kittens slept in a comma of each other, and the cat mother looked at me with a contempt I immediately respected. Outside, the world was glossy. The pier boards gleamed like polished bones. Gulls posed on posts like saints who'd forgotten what they were preaching. My phone pulsed. A new message from the same unknown number. "Sunset. Steps. Bring a voice." I typed back before I could decide not to. "Whose?" No answer came. The message hung there like a sign in a foreign alphabet you're sure you used to read. I walked the town to teach it my rhythm. Tourist season had not yet warmed its hands. The bakery had a stack of almond croissants for once, and I bought one as penance for every breakfast I had ever skipped. I ate it on a bench, beside a bronze fisherman who stared heroically at nothing. Across the street, Elara, unless I had willed her into being stepped out of a door above the thrift shop, her hair wet as if the rain had taken its time leaving. She moved with the self-containment of someone who'd had to fend off too many generosity-shaped chains. "Elara," I said without standing. "Names are invitations. I wanted to be the kind that didn't presume." She paused, looked toward me, and then treated my name for her like a song that had once been a hit but no longer paid the rent. She lit a cigarette, pulled the smoke into her lungs as if it were air she trusted more than the seas, and leaned on the railing. She wore no blue dress now. A black sweater clung to her in small storms. Her eyes were fox-colored in this light amber, impatient. "I thought you didn't talk to strangers," I said. "I don't," she said, and tapped ash onto the pavement like punctuation. "I talk near them." "I'd like to hear you sing." "That's likely," she said, amused. "You people always come wanting to be haunted on camera." "I don't want to be haunted," I said. "I want to know what to do with a haunting I already have." She looked me up and down as if I were a lyric that might scan if read with the right contempt. "Who sent you the video?" "I don't know." "You do," she said. "You just like the drama of not knowing yet." She flicked her cigarette into the gutter. "It was me." "Why?" "Because your grief looked honest," she said, and shrugged one shoulder like a dancer. "And because you were not from here. Outsiders never believe the water is owed anything. They're good for asking real questions." "The sound," I began, and she smiled in a way that made me want to both apologize and pass her a knife. "I sang," she said. "The echo took it. Maybe it will give it back to you. Sometimes the sea likes a new mouth better than the one it stole from." "Why did you sing to Julian?" I asked. I did not mean for the words to come out with the intimacy of a confession. "Elara sings to whoever's listening," she said, but her face betrayed a memory that had been fed too well to be thin. "And he listened like a man building a house out of hearing. That's rare. Most men listen the way a door listens, politely, because they were made to." "Did you love him?" "That's too small a verb," she said. "I was a room he came into. He brought furniture. He didn't move in." Her gaze sharpened. "Do you still want to hear me sing?" "Yes." "Then come tonight," she said. "After you've said your name to the steps, She turned to go and then looked back with something that might have been kindness if it had been less clean. "Don't bring him," she said, meaning Adrian with such precision that I felt the letters of his name click into place between my teeth. The bakery bell rang behind me, and two girls spilled out, laughing over a phone. "I can't believe she posted that," one said. "The way he looks at her, it's like a murder weapon." The other shivered theatrically and bit her croissant. It is an art. Overhearing only what is useful. I went to the harbor. In daylight, the steps Adrian had indicated were merely steps wet wood, green blurred in spots by moss that had received what it prayed for. The water slapped them with small applause. The lighthouse slept. I sat with my notebook open, waiting for the town to tell me where to point my camera. It did not. So I filmed nothing in long, polite takes. The way a gull made a decision, the way a grandmother adjusted a child's hat, the way a dog pulled a man's arm out of time with his grief. By noon the sky had exhausted itself and turned a plain, forgiving gray. I took a bowl of chowder at the diner and tried to derive any joy from it other than warmth. A headline on the television over the counter crawled by. "Coastal drownings up this year." The sound was off. The captioning misheard everything with an endearing earnestness. Rip currents became ripe currents. Rescue operations became rescue occupations, as if saving were a job you clocked in for and then went home from. When I left a bill under my bowl, I found a napkin tucked between the pages of my notebook. It had not been there when I sat down. In a looping hand unfamiliar as the underside of a different sky, someone had written, "If you want to hear him, bring something you stole." I looked up sharply. The waitress pretended to be occupied with the coffee machine. A man in a yellow slicker read a fishing report as if it could be persuaded into better news. Outside, the harbor's light had gone the color of coins again, though sunset was hours off. I slid the napkin into my pocket like a promise and stepped out into a wind that had decided to stir something up. I knocked on 4C mid-afternoon because there are only so many instructions a person can carry alone before she becomes a mule. Adrian opened the door in a t-shirt and the kind of jeans people wear to prove they haven't given up. The room behind him was a temporary church to sound. Two mixing consoles crouched on a desk. A laptop screen glowed with a dawning waveform. A portable reel-to-reel sat on the bed like a beautiful anachronism whose time had come again. Cables coiled on the carpet like black snakes that had decided against venom. A microphone as elegant as a skeleton hung from a stand, and a pair of headphones waited like hands that knew enough to be gentle. "I'm not staying," I said. My throat tightened against my body's attempt to translate a complicated paragraph into a cough. "Can you try it?" He stepped back, allowing me into the room. It was warmer than mine, probably from all the machines. It smelled faintly of tea and the clean hay of new tape. "Give me the drive," he said, and when I hesitated, he added, "You can watch every click." I placed the drive in his palm. He slid it into the laptop with a reverence that made me want to say something cruel to steady myself. He opened my file. The familiar frame still looked like a trap, and pulled the second, secret file I hadn't realized existed out from under it. He saw my face and nodded toward the screen. "Container metadata," he said softly. "It's like a suitcase inside a suitcase. Whoever made this wanted a reader who wasn't polite." "Are you saying I'm impolite?" "I'm saying you're a filmmaker," he said, and his mouth skewed. "Same thing." He loaded the video into his editor. The timeline unfurled like a kitchen rug. There was my silent blue. There was the pier's lit tooth. There was the last frame where his shoulder appeared, ear glint a punctuation mark in a sentence with too many commas. He opened the audio channel, and I braced for flatness. Noise appeared. Not sound exactly, but the ghost of sound, the kind you get if a microphone believes in a room but not in a voice. He ran a series of filters like a person turning a dial between two radio stations, hunting the song he'd been promised in a magazine years ago. The waveform fattened, a texture, then a shimmering, then like a face rising out of a bath, something that resembled a melody. "I was here when she sang," he murmured, as if apologizing. "But this is the lake where the song washed up." He pulled the noise floor down, teased out a frequency bump at 4 kilohertzes with the caution of a surgeon. He layered a de-reverb plug-in that he swore was a miracle, and then rolled his eyes at his own faith. He inverted the phase, isolated a hiss, subtracted it, and there was the sound of wind bending a vocal and making it mean more than the mouth intended. Elara's voice arrived. It wasn't pretty. It was interesting, which is rarer. She sang as if she had to undo a knot with her throat. There were no words I could catch, only vowels that made grief rearrange its furniture. Underneath her, a pulse. Not a drum, not footfalls. A heartbeat pressed too close to the microphone. Adrian sat back. He glanced at me only once, and I felt a prickle under my skin, the way you feel when a person who has forgotten to flirt remembers suddenly and does it properly. "There's more," he said, and split the channels. Something under the vocal, a whispered track, or an unintentional capture. He soloed the lower layer. The room hushed around it, a voice breath thin, like a mouth against a door. "Quyen," it said, my name, but not in my voice, or rather, not in any voice anyone would admit to owning. My name as if coming back to me too sincerely to lie. He replayed it. Quyen. Then another word, smeared by wind. Left. And then you. 2 beats. The kind a metronome makes when it has refused to keep time for a song it despises. Then a soft, wet sound, like a hand leaving wood. I did not know my hands had become fists until my nails bit palm. The napkin in my pocket burned. "If you want to hear him, bring something you stole." "I didn't say that," I said, hating how stupid the sentence sounded in any world that contained microphones. "I know," Adrian said. His voice held calm the way a good glass holds wine. "It's not you. It's the echo." The steps returned voices with their edges shaved off. "How does the echo know my name?" He did not answer. He didn't have to. Names trail like fishing lines through any room that has loved you. The harbor had been learning mine since the moment Julian practiced it against the air. "Again," I said. He played it again, the same sequence, the same soft hitting of wood. He scrubbed forward a second, then 2. Faint, as if spoken from the pocket of someone else's coat, a new phrase, "Room I built, key, under," and then static, as the wind sheared the syllables. "Room?" I echoed. He wanted to build me a room. "There's something else," Adrian said, pointing at the taller spikes spaced at careful intervals. "That pattern, it's not incidental. Someone's tapping. Code." "Morse?" I asked, delighted to have a name to give to a helplessness. He nodded, already dragging a plug-in onto the track that would convert pulse to character. The first sweep produced nonsense RYTE divided by 8 foreign. He adjusted the threshold. The second sweep delivered something neater. Elara. Of course it did. Then, "Don't trust the light." "The light?" I asked, as if there were any other in town we might be speaking of. He didn't have to answer. The lighthouse's beam swept through the glass of his window and drew a stripe across the laptop's keyboard like a warning. "Who tapped?" Adrian murmured. "Not her, she was singing. Not me, I was at the top of the stairs, listening." He scrubbed back to the point where his shoulder entered frame, then forward to the black. He froze it there and stilled the room by stopping even his breathing once, as if he had trained his lungs not to interfere with listening. "There," he said finally, pointing at a shape in the darkness only his guilt could have seen. A knuckle, a fingertip, the edge of a quarter against wood. "You think he—" I couldn't complete it without falling into a well of television tropes and reappearing as a cliché. "Maybe," Adrian said. "Julian liked code. He liked hiding in it." I put a hand to the desk to steady myself and found the reel-to-reel under my fingers. It was older than me. It looked like it had opinions about the way sound ought to travel. "What's this for?" "Truth," Adrian said, and smiled. "Or nostalgia. Hard to tell which. I heard the harbor behaves with tape differently than with bits. You can trick the echo into giving you what it wouldn't give a laptop." "How?" "You feed it back to itself," he said. "You play its own ghost back through the room and ask it if it recognizes the face. Sometimes it blushes." "You've done this before," I said. "Not here," he said. "But I've made a habit of making rooms embarrassed enough to tell me their secrets." And hey devte, he threaded the tape with the careful aggression of someone doing something he loved in front of someone he would not admit to wanting to impress. He recorded 30 seconds of the harbor, captured earlier that morning. He played that 30 seconds back through a small speaker facing the open window, and suddenly the room had two mouths. The harbor talked to itself. The tape hissed like rain politely leaving. He fed that back in a loop of a loop. The waveform on the screen began to grow furred with tiny spikes. The echo, if it is a person, decided to cooperate. I don't know how long we sat like that, watching a machine teach another machine to gossip. Time is a mistranslation in rooms like that. The lighthouse continued to count to itself. The laptop warmed my knees where it rested across the arms of the chair. Adrian's concentration became a shelter I did not deserve but entered anyway. When he stopped the loop, the room shivered. He rolled the tape back and let it run forward again. The hiss had changed flavor. Underneath it, a smaller hiss murmured, as if a mouse had decided to speak English. "Listen," he said, and I did. A voice Julian's cut through with the delicacy of a surgeon opening skin along a faded scar. "Quiet," he said, oh so softly, but in the exact tone he used when he wanted to be forgiven before he asked. "The key? Anchor in 2B. Under the window frame. Room inside a room. When you hear yourself, don't turn around." The last word bled into the tape noise like a pen pressed too hard at the end of a letter. "Promise." I was half up from the chair before my mind caught on my body. "My room," I said. "The key," he echoed. "We went, of course, we went. We left the machines to hum their afterlives and ran down the corridor like adolescents who had stolen time." The woman with the bracelets glanced up as we passed the lobby and nodded once, as if she had been expecting this scene and had already given it a generous review. In 2B, the bedspread still looked edible. The window gazed out toward the lighthouse with the innocence of a complicit friend. I knelt on the floor and pressed my fingers under the frame. Dust apologized to my nails. Nothing. I checked the opposite end. Splinters. The paint gave slightly, like a breath on a lie. "Here," Adrian said, crouching. He slid his thumbnail into a seam I had not known carpenters could coax into wood. The frame popped a whisper's worth, the bottom edge lifted, revealing a cavity narrow as a letter. From it, he coaxed a small brass key on a blue ribbon, enough tarnish to make the ribbon's color honest. My hand shook when he placed it in my palm. "What does it open?" he asked, as if there were a corridor in the inn leading to rooms that weren't on the map. "Room inside a room," I said. "The only room I know is the harbor." I turned to the desk, the nightstand, the wardrobe, the camera case where I kept batteries like secrets. No keyholes accepted the suggestion. The bathroom offered only modern conveniences intent on their own valves. The bed frame was innocent. "Try the floor," he said. We lay elbow to elbow and inspected the boards. One near the window had a different nail steel where the others were brass. A tiny sun in a gray sky. I slipped the key along the seam and the board tipped up delicately, as if grateful to be touched. Beneath, another small cavity waited. Inside lay a cassette tape labeled in Julian's hand, Lark, Draft 4Q. Under it, a folded map of the harbor with an X that had taken its role in myth too seriously and was proud of itself. My breath did an old habit. It held itself in until my heart remembered to knock. I lifted the tape as if it could bruise. Adrian's inhale wasn't loud, but I heard it as if my ear had been taught his lungs by a kind teacher. "Do you have a playa?" I asked. He grinned with the guilty delight of a man who has packed for a day he pretended not to believe in. Of course. He carried a small cassette player, the way a magician carries a deck. He set it on the bed, pressed the tape in, and for a second we were two children at a seance, waiting for a voice to choose to arrive. He pressed play. Silence, but not the kind that lies. The room hushed. The lighthouse light fell against the wall and made a moving ladder. Then, "Quién," Julian's voice, the warmth of home mixed with the metallic taste of a coin held under the tongue. "If you hear this, you came. You always do." I swallowed, and my throat made a sound I hoped would pass for composure. "The echo is crooked, love. It's been returning what we want, not what we say. Or maybe we want what we say to be truer than it is. Either way, there are two shadows. Elara sings into one, I speak into the other. Meet me where the steps remember the man who fell in 1994. Bring something you stole. The water likes to take what is taken. A pause, a breath. And when you hear yourself, don't turn around. I love you. That's the sound I'm trying to prove." The player clicked softly when the tape reached the end of that side. The room felt larger, as if part of it had slid outward to make space for an uninvited guest. "What did you steal?" Adrian asked almost politely. "A time I promised him," I said, too fast. "A future we sketched in pencil," I added, because jokes protect. His face changed, not with judgment, but with a comprehension I was not sure I had earned. "And once," I said, "a sound. He had spent a week perfecting the squeak of a hinge. I used it in a reel before he had exported it." He laughed on the outside and sulked in a room I couldn't find for the rest of the day. The napkin note scalded, insistent. The ribbon on the key looked like the ghost of the blue dress. "Sunset," he said. I nodded. "And Elara will sing after." I forced nonchalance into my voice like stuffing into a too small cushion. He looked away, and for a moment we weren't collaborators or even friends. We were two people trying to be gentle around a live wire. I wanted to take his hand and confess that I sometimes hated the dead for how well they behaved. I wanted to tell him that being watched made my best self stand up straighter. Instead, I wound the blue ribbon around my wrist, as if binding a wound I wasn't ready to show. We split, each to our separate pre-rehearsals. I spent the hour before sunset at the steps, alone, teaching the echo my breath. I set the camera on the tripod and framed the rail where a memorial plaque commemorated the man from 1994, the one Julian had pointed me toward with his recorded voice. The plaque had been polished so often by grieving or curious hands that the letters shone like wet fish. Michael Torres, 1972, 1994. Beloved son and brother. The sea keeps what it keeps. I said the name aloud, because names like to be called by an honest mouth. The tide was rising. The steps swallowed themselves one by one with a stubborn patience that had no time for theatrics. I put the key in my pocket. I put the stolen hinge squeak on my phone, a small sound file I had saved not because I was proud, but because I am a collector of my own crimes. I put my lips close to the step's wet edge and said my name. The echo returned it altered, less a voice than an intention. "Quien," it said back, like a suggestion. Then, quieter, "Don't turn around." I did not. I had the discipline of a coward. I kept my eyes on the water and its mouth. I took out the phone and played the hinge squeak into the steps. The sound and the water had a conversation I was not educated enough to follow. The echo changed shape, a ripple given a purpose. "Key," it said, or perhaps I made it say that with my need. My hands, treacherous, moved toward my pocket where the blue ribbon hummed. I pulled the key free and placed it on the second wettest step. The sea reached for it like a friend who had not learned the appropriate distance. The ribbon dampened, went darker, became the exact color of the remembered dress. The lighthouse lit the key briefly, and I felt the town take a breath. "Julian," I said softly, "the way you say grace when you are alone and not sure if anyone is supposed to hear. I'm here." The echo took my words, rinsed them, and returned a different offering. "I'm here," a second voice said, with Julian's apology beneath it like the bass in a song. "Room, don't a slap of wave against step. Light lies." Then another sound, unexpected and ordinary, puncturing the myth with its domesticity. The faint click of a camera shutter from somewhere just over my left shoulder. I did not turn. I kept my eyes on the water with a fanatic devotion that would have made any god jealous. The echo approved. It made a small, pleased sound of vowel smiling. The key slid forward a fraction, as if pulled by a string the water was tired of hiding. The ribbon's end lifted, then lay down again with a sigh. "Who's there?" I asked the air, because dignity has never been my talent. No answer, only the lighthouse counting. In the corner of my vision periphery is where truth often feels safest. A shape moved, a figure lowered, a hand hovered at the edge of the frame of my life. The camera captured none of it because I had set it to a frame too earnest for ghosts. Then, a song. Elara's voice in the distance, not on the steps, but from the direction of the old cannery, where gulls had made a church. She sang the melody Adrian had extracted from the embedded quiet. But this time there were words, and they were not forgiving. "Between two shadows, choose the door with a lock. Between two truths, choose the one that doesn't need you." The echo returned her cruelty softer, as if it had decorum. I felt tears, ridiculous in a climate this damp, and refused them. which is to say I let them happen without telling them what they meant. The key nudged again. A small, pale hand, that is what my mind invented for the moment when water found it acceptable to be hand-like touched. And then the key was gone. The ribbon remained a second longer, like a lizard's tail pretending independence, and then it went too. The step looked as it had before. The harbor blinked, and I had not been prepared for how frankly I would miss a small piece of brass I hadn't known existed that morning. I exhaled. The echo exhaled back unhelpfully. The camera stopped on its own, because I had set a timed record and because narratives love neatness. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number or from the same unknown. Since all unknowns are siblings, don't trust the light. Trust the knock. I stood slowly, every movement audited by a fear not yet named. The sun had reached the angle where the water feigned sincerity. Elara's voice had ceased, or the town had chosen to stop translating it for me. I turned deliberately away from the steps and faced the pier. For a moment, the lighthouse's beam lit the face of a man standing where the benches begin. He might have been Adrian. He might have been a ghost with good posture. He might have been my loneliness deciding to dress up. The light went and the man with it, because that is what men and light do. On my way back toward the Anchor Inn, a child ran into me, failing to brake a scooter in time. He looked up at me with the perfect interest of the young who haven't yet understood that adults are only children with rings. "You're the YouTube lady," he said, thrilled with his taxonomy. "My mom says you make funerals famous." "What does your mom say about the lighthouse?" I asked. "Because we are all a little cruel with the curious." He grinned. "She says it keeps secrets the way cats keep secrets. It pretends they're for your own good." He zipped off before I could ask him to be my manager. Back in 2B, the window was clean again, and I could see the lighthouse without distortion. The board I had lifted lay square in its bed. I wanted to put my ear to the floorboards and listen for retrospective signification. I wanted to call my mother and lie to her about how I was eating. I wanted to knock on 4C and not say a word. I wanted all of it with equal purity. Instead, I pressed play on the cassette again, laid it on the pillow beside me like a friend, and closed my eyes while Julian's voice, recorded in a room I had not yet learned to find, told me to do the one thing I had done all day. When you hear yourself, don't turn around. Promise. I didn't sleep. I drifted. The drift was the kind you get in a small boat tied to a larger one, the sense of being moved by something you trust because it has weight. At midnight, a knock came. Not at the door, beneath the window. 3 taps, spaced like polite strangers on a bench. The lighthouse's light skipped across the ceiling as if suddenly young. Somewhere in the hall, a kitten provided a commentary. I lay still, counted, and did not turn. And because I obeyed what the dead told me, the next thing the night gave me was a voice from the floorboards that knew my name, but wore it as if trying on a coat in a mirror. My mother's voice, maybe, or my own returned by an echo determined to persuade me of something terrible and true. "Quiet," it said, "the room you're in is inside a bigger one. Don't trust the light, trust the knock. And when he asks you to choose, ask him which loss is his favorite." I whispered back to the boards, feeling ridiculous and holy. "Which he?" the lighthouse answered, because lighthouses always do. It swept, and the room that seemed the whole world for a moment turned out to be only one of those nested boxes tourist shops sell. Painted ocean outside, painted town outside, painted house outside, painted room. From somewhere below, From the step that had liked my voice enough to throw me back a different tune came a single tap, a sound no louder than a ring set down on wood. I did not move. Obedience is not always noble, but it is sometimes all you have. When morning leaned into the window again, I could have believed I'd dreamed everything if the cassette hadn't still been warm. The napkin in my pocket had blurred where my hand had sweated against the words, as if the message had been embarrassed by my insistence. "Bring something you stole," it read, the line through stolen underlined now by damp insistence. I went downstairs, ordered coffee, and found Alara at a corner table, hands around a cup as if it were staking claim to her heat. "You heard it," she said without asking. "The knock? The light lies," I said. "All light lies," she replied. "It pretends it's straight. It forgets that it arrives bent by whatever it passes through." She tilted her head in a gesture that would have been flirtation on anyone else. On her, it was a dare. "Tonight," she said, "the cannery. I'll sing. You'll film. He'll choose." She stood then, and I saw that beneath her sweater she wore a ribbon looped twice around her wrist. Blue, the exact color. "Your ribbon," I said. She glanced down and smiled without warmth. "It's a town," she said. "We all borrow." Outside, the harbor pretended at innocence again, its surface smooth as a lie that has been rehearsed for generations. I sipped the coffee until my mouth remembered that bitterness is proof of presence. Adrian would be listening next door, kneading sound into statements. The lighthouse would practice its sermons. The steps would store our names like coins beneath a floorboard. And somewhere, in a room I had not yet managed to open, a door would wait, and a lark between two shadows would lean against the wrong one, listening for a lock to click. The lark between two shadows. Chapter 3. Don't trust the light. By afternoon, the town had settled into one of those unnerving calms it wears, the way a magician wears sleeves wide enough to hide anything. I walked the length of the harbor twice to give my nerves a direction to point themselves. The gulls had gone elsewhere, as if the day's script required fewer witnesses. The bronze fisherman's nose shone brighter than the rest of him from 1,000 superstitious rubs. The cannery sat at the far end of the cove, brick softened by salt, windows like sleepy eyes too long unwashed. I told myself that if I could narrate the day as I lived it, I would be safe. I lifted the camera and recorded my own feet, the pier boards, the way the lighthouse's beam idled against the sky even in daylight, as if unable to set down its instrument. I spoke quietly to the lens habit. Insurance. Greyhallow, late afternoon. Heading to the cannery. Alara will sing. Adrian will listen. I'll do both and try not to choose. The anchor inn's cat regarded me from the porch steps like a bouncer who had seen too much. The woman with the bracelets had taken the kittens into a basket lined with a folded sweater and had taped a sign to the front desk, "No adoptions until eyes open." Underneath, a smaller line, "No exceptions for the mournful." It made me smile, which felt like stealing warmth from a stranger and putting it in your pocket. The napkin in that pocket had dried into a crisp truth. "Bring something you stole." I held the cassette again, turning it in my hands the way you'd turn a glass if you'd decided that looking was a kind of drinking. I wanted to call Adrian, to tell him I'd meet him at the cannery early, to ask him to set up something impossible. Instead, I wrote him a note, "Cannery at dusk. If I'm late, start without me. Don't trust the light." And slid it under 4C. "Trust the knock." I didn't write. as if the phrase were a spell that lost power with repetition. Greyhallow had a library that struggled under its own earnestness. I ducked in because sometimes a building full of paper is the only place a person who films everything can remember she used to read. The librarian wore a cardigan the color of thunderstorms and the particular smile librarians have when they approve of your face and are not yet bored by your questions. "Michael Torres," I said. 1994. She nodded with a precision that told me she had been waiting for the question since the plaque had been polished last. She pulled a thin folder from a drawer. "Clipping file. You're not the first. Won't be the last," I said. The edges were soft with handling. Inside, a black and white photo of a boy whose hair obeyed him and eyes that had not yet had to forgive much. A headline: "Local teen drowns at harbor steps." A paragraph that mentioned rip currents, alcohol, grief. A smaller story from 3 months later: "Torres family moves inland." And one around the same time with a picture of the lighthouse, beam fat with fog, new keeper, takes over light. The girl in the picture looked barely older than me, with a braid thick enough to be a rope. Her name was written in the caption, L. Eames. "L for?" I asked. The librarian shrugged. "Linnea? Lily? Linda? Nobody ever wrote it out. The job went automated 5 years back, but she kept the cottage by the light. People say she still goes up there and polishes the lens just to keep her hands honest." "L," I said, and the letter sat in my mouth with the familiarity of a person you almost remember at a party. L for light, L for lies, L for Linnea, which seemed too delicate a name for someone who keeps ships from pretending rocks aren't rocks. Elara and the keeper? "YouTube doesn't keep those records, honey," she said gently. "But if the sea's involved, everybody's met everybody, one way or another." "May I?" I asked, motioning toward the photocopier. She nodded. "And if you're going to the cannery," she added, with the small, sad smile of a woman who had learned to care without being thanked for it, "keep your hands where the echo can see them." At the door, she called after me, "And don't go alone. These old buildings fall in love with people like you. They don't mean to, but they hold on." I didn't promise anything. I have learned not to. By the time I reached the cannery, dusk had turned the world to a set built in black and pearl. This had once been a machine for opening. The harbor would deliver its silver. The belts would shudder. Men and women would split shine into meat. Cans would roll like promises. Now the belts slept under tarps, and the floor had taken on the polish of grief. A stage had been coaxed into the far corner out of pallets and hope. An amp sat squatting like a well-behaved dog. A microphone on a stand waited with a patience learned from good furniture. Adrian was there already, of course. He had set a pair of small speakers where the echo could be tempted into conversation and had placed a recorder on a crate in the exact spot where the room changed from brick to wood. He had taped a square on the floor with blue painter's tape, as if marking an X where the sound would like to be found. He saw me, and for a second the careful thing on his face unlatched. "You came," he said, and the obviousness of it did not make it less a relief. I did. I lifted the camera. Let him see it see him. He nodded at the cassette in my hand. "Bringing the stolen?" I laughed despite the way the word curved. "Bringing the proof? Good." He had that current running under his skin again. The one sound people get when they've arranged everything within reach, and the one thing they want is not theirs to arrange. I ran a line to the rafters. The room hums at 60 hertz like it's in love with a ghost's heartbeat. I can pull it away if it gets greedy. "Don't trust the light," I said softly, as if we were telling each other passwords. "Never do," he said, and gestured toward the far wall. Someone had draped a tarp there that billowed slightly in a draft no map acknowledged. "I brought this." He lifted the tarp and revealed an old Fresnel lens the size of a first marriage, its concentric rings glittering even under the indifferent cannery lamps. Retired from the light when they swapped to LEDs, Linnea loaned it. "L," I said, tasting the letter. He glanced at me, surprised. "You met her?" "No," I said, "but the library has a memory longer than the harbor. She's the keeper still, even if the switch is automatic." He smiled. "Don't let her hear you call it automatic. She says the sea doesn't respect anything with that many syllables." He stepped closer to the lens, and the reflected shapes of him multiplied. I saw his hands in triplicate, his mouth in slices, his eyes carried in rings like a saint's relic. "She says the lens is a room that knows how to bend truth until it arrives whole." I touched the glass with one finger and felt the chill of things made for clarity. The cannery's single work light flared into a dozen, each convinced it was the source. I tried not to think about the recorder under the stairs of the Anchor Inn and the way Julian's voice had arrived honest because it had traveled crooked. The door at the far end opened then. Of course it did, and Elara stepped in with her sweater thrown around her shoulders like an unearned apology. Two men followed carrying stools, and a woman with hair the color of burnt sugar rolled in a cooler. The room breathed a hello, and then pretended it hadn't. "You set the stage," Elara said to Adrian, without looking at him long enough to make it a compliment. She passed me with a nod that did not commit to anything. "I marked your sweet spot," he said, pointing to the taped square. "If you stand there, the echo will return your vowels as if they were building materials." "Say, I don't need help with vowels," she said, setting her cigarette case on the stool. She was not the kind of singer who warmed up. She set her mouth to work the way a carpenter sets a plane to wood and lets the first curl tell her if the day is good. A few townspeople gathered, those who had refused dinner invitations or escaped them, those who liked the way a song changes air. The librarian stood by the door with her hands in her pockets, just far enough in to claim she'd attended, far enough back to leave early if the room told a truth she wasn't willing to carry home. The woman from the inn leaned against a stack of pallets, bracelets quiet, eyes alert. Even the bronze fisherman had, in the way of statues, shifted his attention enough to suggest he might later claim to have been present. Adrian checked levels. I framed the lens, the tape square, Elara's mouth. The light overhead flickered in good taste and then steadied. A draft slipped through the building like an opinion. Elara stood where she'd been asked not to stand and then stepped neatly into the taped square with the triumphant shrug of someone proving she's not stubborn, merely theatrical. "Tonight," she said into the room, not into the microphone, as if we were all refined enough to hear without electronics, "I'm going to sing a song that doesn't like being sung." She smiled at the lens, and it fractured her into versions that would all deny each other in court. "If it likes you back, you'll hear your name. If it doesn't, go home and polish whatever you use to blame people with." Adrian glanced at me. "She's in a mood," he said under his breath. I raised the camera to my eye and felt the gentle terror that is my most honest drug. The knowledge that I would be given something I would spend the rest of my life failing to return properly. Elara began. It wasn't a melody, not first. It was a tone drawn thin enough to be a wire. Then another above it, like a line added to a map to show a new road to the same place. The room responded. The rafters learned how to stand up straighter. She sang words, eventually, but only after deciding they could bear the weight of what the vowels had done. Between two shadows, she sang, choose the door with the knock. Between two promises, choose the one that can't be filmed. The room returned her song draped in someone else's coat. I heard my name in the refrain, or I pretended to because need is a tuning fork. Quyen, somewhere behind me, warm. Quyen, softer, from below the floor. Polite as a neighbor, I did not turn. The advice had migrated from tape to bone. Adrian rolled the tape, hands light on the faders, as if he were coaxing a small, miraculous animal out of underbrush. The lens on the floor caught the canary's lamp and turned it into a bouquet of small suns. The light moved over Alara's face and reassembled it into something hard to memorize. People shifted their weight in that unconscious choreography. Audiences always perform when they are afraid of not reacting properly to something real. Don't trust the light, Alara sang, looking at me with a malice I couldn't quite take personally. Trust the knock. The door at the end of the cannery knocked in, once. No one had stood near it. People smiled with their mouths and not their eyes, as if life had finally obliged them by becoming a story. The librarian's hands came out of her pocket slowly, as if from water. It was not a performance so much as a ceremony. I have been to enough weddings to distrust those, and enough funerals to trust them too much. When the song leaned into its last curve, the room leaned too, and then too neat. I thought even as I thrilled to it, entirely too neat, the lighthouse's beam found a crack in the cannery wall and slipped through at the precise angle to skate along the floor, up the lens, across the tape's casing, and land on my hands. I went cold. Alara kept singing, vowels bending like metal made plastic by heat, consonants tossed overboard. The beam stuck to my knuckles, thin as a bracelet. I had the childish urge to shake it off. Don't trust the light, I reminded myself, and the light heard me the way a person hears their own name in a foreign country. It paused, then proceeded as if I had mispronounced it. The cooler clicked. The door knocked again, twice. The echo returned a phrase I did not recall, saying, I left, and then something that felt like a wrong translation of a kiss. Adrian looked over, eyes questioning, but his body remained in conversation with levels, noise floors, thresholds, the tape reel's word. The people in the room forgot they were people and became an audience, then forgot that too, and became something like a wave. And then he arrived. Not Julian, not the obvious haunting, not the comforting symmetry. A man stepped from behind the stacked pallets, not from the door, not from the room's architecture, but from that trick space where rooms keep their mistakes. He was older than the last time the town had photographed him, his hair grown out of fashion and into defiance, his hands steadier. He wore a jacket that had learned to be rainproof because it had to. His eyes were the same as the black and white clipping from the library, grayer maybe, but still carrying that impatient intelligence some boys have, the kind that gets them in trouble when the sea thinks it has a better idea. Michael, the librarian said softly, a confession she did not know she'd carried. Her hands flew to her mouth too late to catch the word. A dozen possible explanations sprinted through my head and tripped over one another. A nephew, a look-alike, a ghost that had read its assignment too literally, a town's desire to correct a past so vivid it had demanded a body. He stood where the taped square's corner caught his heel and looked at Alara with a knowledge that understood the price of every note. He looked at me with caution. He looked at the lens and did not blink. Ilara's voice did a thing voices do when their owner's body wants to stop and it refuses to. She finished the note. The echo sent it back with somebody else's bravery attached. The room hushed in a way that had nothing to do with volume. Adrian coaxed the tape to keep rolling with motions so small they felt like thought. "I heard you," Michael said, his voice shocking for its lack of drama. He spoke like someone who had spent a long time talking to things that could not answer and had only recently relearned the pleasure of an audience. "You've been calling, shouting sometimes." He rubbed his thumb against his palm as if the air had given him a splinter. "And you," he said to me, "your video, your silence." I lowered the camera because it was suddenly either the rudest or the most honest thing in the room. "You drowned," I said, as if I had the right to accuse, as if journalism were a license to demand resurrection. "Once," he said mildly, "not twice." He shrugged with a small practical dignity. "The water took me and then returned me a different shape. People like the first shape better, easier to pity." "Where have you been?" the librarian whispered, almost angry with her own astonishment. "Below," he said, and there was no poetry in it, which is how I knew he was telling the truth. He lifted his chin toward Alara. "She sings to the line, not the light. The line between rooms. You can go under it if you learn how to breathe wrong." Alara inhaled and exhaled, each an aria. "Why now?" she asked. And if there was love in it, it was the kind that had eaten all the other kinds to survive. He looked at the lens, at the cannery walls, at the taped square, at me, at Adrian, at the room itself. "Because he asked me to," he said, nodding toward somewhere the rest of us were not seeing. "And because the knock finally sounded like a door and not a warning." "Who asked?" I said, throat dry. "Julian," he said, and the word did not buckle under the weight of my wanting. "He figured out which room I was in. He said you needed to be told where to stand." "Where?" I asked. "Too fast?" Michael's eyes softened in a way that made me want to ask him when his last kindness not borrowed by necessity had been. "You're already there," he said. "You always are." He stepped closer to the lens and put his hands just so along its sides, the way I'd seen some men hold the faces of women they'd failed and still were allowed to touch. You have to choose when to face what. The knock is truth. The light is show. He glanced toward the window where dusk had thickened to the expensive part of night. "When they happen together, pick the knock. Pick the knock," the room repeated, which is to say the echo repeated it, which is to say, if you want to be precise about it. The rafters and the bricks and all the things people had built with their hands agreed to practice honesty for a second. "Why tell me?" I asked him. "Why not tell her?" I jerked my chin toward Alara, whose face had not moved, but whose mouth had decided it would not continue with the plotted set list of the evening. "Because she already knows," he said. "She knows every rule and every way to ignore it. But you're about to make a room for strangers. You're about to sell a story to people who think they're buying sympathy. You need to decide which loss is your favorite." The phrase made something in me run at the sound like a dog who knows its name and hates that it does. The boards under my feet knocked once soft, as if embarrassed to be right in public. I kept my eyes on Michael because I had raised myself on warnings. "What does the light lie about?" I asked, because sometimes the difference between a mystery and an answer is the question you thought to pose. "It lies about direction," he said. "It makes you think everything important is where it points." He smiled, and I saw the boy from the clipping and the man he had had to be to survive being the boy. It's a marvelous liar. It keeps ships from pretending, but it wins at its game too much. People forget their own bearings. Ilara finally moved. She stepped off the taped square, picked up her cigarette case, and flipped it open with a sound like a small insult. "Are you going to apologize?" she asked Michael, without rancor. "I have," he said simply. "Every day you sang, hem most." "I didn't sing for you," she said, and the sentence was so true it didn't have to be entirely accurate. She turned to me. "And you started this." "I did," I said, because denying it would have been a smaller lie than the lights, but a lie nonetheless. "Then finish it," she said. "Choose." "I don't." "You do," she said. "You like to pretend you don't because not choosing is an art and an economy. But not choosing is also a choice. Decide which room to film. The one with the light that tells everybody what to think, or the one with the knock that nobody can hear on their phones." Adrian had gone quiet. Not in sound, his hands still moved, the tape still rolled, but in that way men go quiet when they refuse to make your choice for you and hope you'll choose them anyway. He wouldn't look at me. He had placed himself as far away on the floor as he could without leaving the room, like a man drawing a boundary and then pretending it had always been there. The people, half a dozen more, had become furniture. They were kind enough not to cough. The lighthouse sent a beam across the far wall and, this time, did not find a seam to slip through. The door knocked once. Not a question. "Julian," I said to the room, "because the things you cannot carry alone you say to the dead and hope they volunteer. Tell me." The tape slowed the tiniest fraction, as if the room had offered the machine its own heartbeat to help it keep going. A hiss changed color. Then his voice, from the cassette so many hours earlier that it felt like a different century. "When you hear yourself, don't turn around. Promise." It came not from the player on the crate, but from the rafters, from the seam between brick and beam, from the place the cannery had learned to hide its wrong breaths. And then a new line, the one I hadn't yet earned. "Choose the knock. Film the light. Name the lie." A humiliating part of me wanted to ask for easier grammar, but I am a woman who grew up in rooms where the elders spoke in proverbs and then judged you by the way you translated them into dinner. I nodded. "All right," I said softly to no one, which is to say, to everyone who had come here to be told what to do. "All right." I lifted the camera and pointed it at the lens. The light the cannery had loaned me multiplied. The shapes of the people in the room divided into a choir of selves. In the viewfinder, Elara was 10 women, and each of them dangerous. Adrian, fractured, looked like a man performing 3 decisions simultaneously. The librarian existed only in planes, as if she, more than the rest of us, knew how to be paper and therefore how to survive. Michael was a radius. You could plot arcs off him and still return to something true. I pressed record, which is a ritual and a consent and a sin. "Talk," I said to Elara. She blinked at me, amused by the command. "You always ask singing people to talk when they do something you don't own." "Talk," I said again, "because sometimes you cannot afford to be polite with your own fear." She stepped closer to the lens. Her mouth grew large in my viewfinder. Her teeth translated into jeweler's work by the glass. "The light lies," she said clearly. "For the record, it pretends you always know where to look. The knock tells you to earn it." She angled her face into one of the lens's side arcs and became a woman made of cautious scissors. "He'll choose," she added, and glanced at Michael. He nodded. "I'll go back below," he said simply. "It's where I belong when I'm not being told otherwise." He turned to me then, because I had asked for truth, and people give you the version of it that lets them keep living. There are people who need to hear they can be lost and not gone. I can be that for them. Elara can be the room they say it in. You can be the door. And Adrian? I asked before I could behave, as if his body were not right there bent over his machines like an answer that had already been given. Michael smiled with something like affection. He's the hinge, he said. He makes the door sound like a choice every time it opens. The tape ticked in triumph. The lighthouse finally gave up trying to get in and went on counting the sea for someone else. The people remembered their bodies, coughed, shifted, looked at one another with the careful intimacy that happens when strangers find themselves at church together by accident. The cannery door knocked one last time and then swung in on a draft. Night came through politely. Michael nodded toward it as a man greets an old friend he is not always proud of. "I'll see you under," he said to Elara. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She lifted her cigarette case and closed it with that metal note, and he took it as an answer, which may be the definition of intimacy. He looked at me. "Don't let them make this about romance," he said. "Let them keep their hearts intact for once. Make it about sound. Make it about how rooms make us say what we'd rather forget. Make them hear the knock." He stepped backward and became the part of the room he'd stepped out of. I don't know that I believe in disappearing. I think he learned the cannery better than the rest of us. He chose the seam. He went under the line. Elara started a new song as if the previous one had been a throat clearing. Adrian let the tape roll until it could not any more, and then set a finger on the reel to keep it from snapping. The librarian gave me a look that said, not unkindly, "You'd better be careful." The woman with the bracelets had tears on her face without having paid for them. When it ended without applause. The people left like smoke leaves having spent itself, uninterested in being thanked. Elara lit the cigarette she'd been threatening all night and inhaled the way some people sip soup. The mouth celebrates, but the stomach does not believe. Adrian stayed by the machines a long minute and then came to me. He didn't touch me. He stood a shoulder away, a respectful geography. "You chose," he said, not quite a question. "I did," I said. "I'm going to film the light doing what it does, lying beautifully, and I'm going to cut the knock in so no one can pretend they didn't hear it. They'll try. I'll make it impossible." He considered this with the seriousness he usually reserved for knobs and waveforms. "You'll lose some," he said finally. "I'll lose different ones," I replied, "and maybe keep a few I'd like to have in the room when it ends." He nodded, the kind of nod that concludes one pact and begins another. "There's something else," he said, and produced from his pocket not a key, not a note, but a small brass hinge. "I found this under the taped square. It must have fallen from the rafters when the room tried to stand up for us." He held it out to me. "Want it?" I took it without thinking to perform modesty. The hinge warmed in my palm like a tiny animal I would be asked to feed later. "I stole its sound once," I said, answering the tape's dare. "Maybe I owe it the courtesy of a credit." Elara approached, its own weather around her. "You'll want to talk to her," she said, nodding toward the lighthouse hill where a small cottage squatted under the big granite shoulder like a truth hiding under a legend. The keeper. She taught me where the line was before the light forgot to be a person. "Now?" I asked. "If you wait," she said. "You'll film a sunrise. Those are easier to sell, but they don't tell you anything you couldn't have guessed. Night knows the good stories. Go now." Adrian studied my face the way you study a dial you've learned to read better than the manufacturer intended. "I can strike," he said, motioning to the machines. "Meet me after." "And, I'll come up," I said, as if the hill were not steep and my heart not busier than it had a right to be. We walked out together and then parted in the doorway like actors who have to be in different scenes. The night was salt and question. The lighthouse beam wrote patient lines across the low clouds. Halfway up the hill, the ground went from gravel to path to something like a promise. The cottage's windows glowed a yellow that felt earned. I lifted my hand and knocked. One knock, then two. I thought of the room's advice and smiled despite the fact that smiling isn't in my nature when the stakes feel this articulate. The door opened on a woman whose braid was now the color of storms over wheat. Her face had been carved by the weather into something the wind respected. She looked at my camera. She looked at my hands. She looked at my eyes last. "You brought the wrong truth," she said, not unkind. "I brought the lights," I said. "I'm here for the knocks." "Good," she said, and stood aside so the lighthouse could not help but shine on me like a joke it got at last. "Come in. Leave the lens by the door. It doesn't know how to mind its own business." I set the camera gently on a bench beside boots marked by work. She glanced at the hinge in my hand and smiled at it like an old friend. "You found it," she said. "I told the cannery it would need that one day." She put the kettle on and then did a thing I haven't seen anyone do since my grandmother died. She put her ear to the wall as if it might be about to confess. "L," I said, and when she turned I saw that the letter had sat comfortably on her since the clipping. She was one of those people who know what to keep. "You've been warned about me," she said, "that I collect rooms, that I polish lenses, that I believe the sea is a person." "The usual," I said, "and that the light lies." She poured tea. "It lies. So does the knock," she said, and smiled at my face. "You weren't ready for that. The knock can be faked. Children learn that before they learn anything else." She handed me a mug. It smelled like the inside of a cupboard where all your best decisions live. "What you need is the third thing." "What third thing?" She leaned back against the counter and looked at me the way a light might look if it had eyes. "The breath," she said. "The breath between knock and light. That's the part that doesn't lie. It's too fast for performance. It's the room inhaling, deciding whether to be honest." Outside, the beam swept the window, and the tea in my cup made a small silver map. My hands remembered every door I'd ever paused before. I thought of Julian teaching himself to hear winter rain. I thought of Adrian feeding tape to a machine that asked to be trusted. I thought of Elara choosing words like knives and then singing so the knives turned into spoons that still cut. I thought of Michael choosing under. "Can you teach me to hear it?" I asked. "I can show you where to stand," she said. "The rest you know, people who love rooms always do." She nodded toward the tower. "Bring the hinge. The door up there sticks when it wants to keep a secret." I picked up the brass, and it fit my hand as if apologizing for having been misused. Elle led me out into the night, up the iron steps that spiraled like logic to the lantern room. The glass around us had been polished so hard that it had remembered it had once been sand. She stood with her back to the lens and gestured to a spot on the floorboards. "Here," she said. "Breathe. The knock will come. The light will lie. The breath will tell you whose lie you can live with." I stood. I breathed. The harbor below glowed coins again, though the moon had not yet committed to a full show. The lighthouse ticked in a language not meant for ears. Far below, the cannery door closed itself with a reluctant courtesy, and the room inside it settled, and a reel-to-reel turned once more in the dark like a memory proving it had mass. When the knock came 3 soft beats from the landward side where no door was, it found me where I'd been told to stand. The light's sweep gilded my hands. Between them, for a second small enough to be honest, there was a breath. I heard it. It sounded like yes and no and choose and stay, layered into one syllable no dictionary bothers with. It sounded like the first inhale after you surface. It sounded like my name said by a mouth that knew how to return it without rehearsing. It sounded like a lark beating its wings between 2 shadows, not sure which to rest in, not sure which would lift it. Good, Elle said quietly behind me. Now don't forget it when you're editing. Godity, I laughed, and the laugh was not pretty, which is how I knew it was going to help. The hinge in my hand warmed like something that had forgiven a theft. The lens did what it always does. The room did what rooms sometimes agree to when you ask the way a person asks a person they have loved well. And over the harbor, where the steps remember names better than the plaques do, a voice too soft to quote said my name, and then said a word I finally heard clearly because I had stopped trying to stay. The Lark Between 2 Shadows. Chapter 4. The Hinge Remembers. The word stay had followed me down the iron spiral like a moth that refused to choose which flame to die in. By the time Elle and I reached the cottage again, my legs were the kind of tired that makes the heart louder. She put her hand on the latch the way a person touches a forehead to check for fever. Every hinge remembers, she said, as if continuing a conversation I'd begun in another life. Give it something better to say. She took the small brass piece from my palm and set it on the table as if laying down a coin to pay the bill for a long meal. The cottage clock made a sound like a breath agreeing with itself. She poured more tea and looked at me not like a subject, but like a tool she was deciding how to keep. You'll cut between the light and the knock, she said, not asking. I will, I said, and the breath. She nodded, satisfied the way only an old keeper gets satisfied with economy and a refusal to call it pride. Bring the hinge back tomorrow, she said. It belongs to the door upstairs even if it likes your hand. Outside, the hill had taken on that solemn invisibility towns wear after midnight, when even the most dramatic buildings agree to be silhouettes. I walked down to the harbor and breathed on the steps just to hear the water consider me. It said nothing. It had already said what it needed to and was letting me decide whether I believed it. At the Anchor Inn, the kittens had rearranged themselves into an exclamation mark. The woman with the bracelets dozed in a chair with her knitting fallen in her lap like a net that had caught dreams instead of fish. I let myself into 2B and sat on the bed with the cassette in my hands and the room's old wood listening. My phone lit up with a waterfall of messages I had been ignoring. There were thousands. My last upload had turned the internet into a choir that could not agree on its hymn. Some cried exploitation. Some offered Venmo'd grief like tips. Some told me where their brothers had drowned and how. Some asked what shade of blue the dress was. The algorithm likes it best when you bring it bodies it can count. I typed and erased the same sentence 5 times, I think I heard him, and then put the phone face down. The unknown number pinged, midnight tomorrow, steps. Bring the lens or bring the breath. Choose. I stared at it. Who are you? I asked, the way a child asks a door not to be a monster. The 3 dots began and then disappeared. Began and disappeared like a person changing their mind at the threshold of confession. You know me, the reply came finally. I'm the room that tells you what you would rather not narrate. I wanted to throw the phone out the window. Instead, I set it on the windowsill and watched the lighthouse write its neat lines across the dark until my eyes learned the rhythm and started anticipating where the beam would land. It did not go where I expected. It rarely does. In the morning, the kittens had opened their eyes into the same world we had failed to make less bewildering. I brought Elle her hinge, which had warmed overnight into the color of promises you intend to keep. She took it with a nod. "It remembered you," she said, "but it knows where it lives." "Who's been texting me?" I asked, as if keepers are responsible for the town's anonymous honesty. "Rooms," she said, and smiled as if she'd said something helpful. "And occasionally, people pretending to be rooms." "Elara," I guessed. "She prefers songs," Elle said. "Words taste too fixed in her mouth. Don't get tangled. You have enough knots." Back in 2B, I set up the laptop like a small altar. Adrian knocked once, the respectful way, the way that tells a room it is all right to be honest. He stood in the doorway with coffee and a face that had processed the night and had not decided what to do with it. "Can we go through it?" he asked. "We have to," I said. He set the cups down, then froze, because the sunlight had happened to fall through the window into the precise geometry the Fresnel would have made of it. Refractions lined the floorboards like ribs. He glanced to the window frame, to the board we'd lifted, to the gap where the cassette had been. "This room has too many shapes for a small place," he said softly. "All rooms do," I said. "We only notice in the ones where we decide to live." He smiled the crooked smile of a man who had dared to sleep and not been punished for it. Roll, we rolled. We stacked last night's cannery take in a timeline, Elara's vowels like beveled glass, the cannery's echo returning what it chose. When Michael stepped out of the room's seam, I felt again the way the air had stepped aside for him. Adrian didn't flinch. He zoomed in on the moment before Michael's body took the stage from the wall. The pixels went grainy, the way truth always does when you put your face too close to it. "There," he said, pointing to a ripple along the stretcher of pallets he'd hidden behind. "The draft." The room exhaled first. "The breath," I said. He toggled the audio around the exhale. The room inhaled, the exhale arrived. The hinge, our hinge, made the smallest exclamation, then the appearance. He soloed the breath, and we listened to it the way people sometimes listen to themselves say "I love you" in their head before letting it out. It contained no lie because it was too fast to prepare. "Our cut," he said. "We do it on the breath." "On the breath," I echoed, grateful to be saying a craft sentence instead of a myth. We built the skeleton of a film. I kept the light beautiful and untrustworthy. I let the knock land without music, without pity. I made people walk with their weight honestly. I kept Michael a man, not a miracle. I left Elara sharp. I left myself out as much as I could and then put myself back in where it mattered, because a story no one owns is the kind that gets stolen by the first liar with time. "Will you tell them he's alive?" Adrian asked, eyes still on the screen, fingers at rest on the keys as if he could conduct forgiveness. "I'll tell them he chose under," I said, "and that I saw him, and that whether they believe me is the lie the light tells them about themselves." "And us?" he said, and the word was so simple it stranded me. "We're hinges," I said, hearing Michael's frankness arrive in my mouth without rehearsal. "We make the door sound like a choice every time it opens." He looked at me then the way a person looks at the truth when they are not sure their hands are clean enough for it. "I want to be more than hardware," he said quietly, "but if Hinge is the job, I'll do it right." "You already are more than hardware," I said, surprising both of us with tenderness. You're the one who hears the room before it decides to lie. He do a too, or alters have less. A noise from the hallway rescued us from having to stand too long in that particular light. The cat had decided to escort her kittens on a tour of the second floor. The smallest looked at us with the entitlement of the newly sighted. Adrian crouched and offered his hand, and was approved. If I were writing a different kind of story, I would tell you I saw him as a father in that moment, a householder. I would imply that love is the certainty of a future. What I saw was a man named by an animal and changed by the pronouncing. Midnight, I said. The steps again. He nodded. We bring the lens? Or the breath? I said. We can't carry both. He's had Ennis. Then the breath, he said immediately, with the impatient intelligence of a good engineer. The lens lies the way light lies, the breath we can hear and not pretend we made. The text said, bring the lens or bring the breath, I said. It wanted us to pick the obvious one, then do the opposite, he said. And I remembered the night before how Michael had told me to film the light but choose the knock. I wrote breath in my notebook with a line under it like a road and shut the book as if that would make the choice stay chosen. The day turned itself over and offered a new side like a child learning to sleep. I walked the town with the camera slung across my back and watched people pretend not to want to be seen. Alara didn't show herself until late afternoon when she cracked the door of the upstairs flat above the thrift shop and let smoke draft down. I stood on the sidewalk and didn't look up. Thank you, I said to the air, for not choosing for me. I tried. Her voice floated down, amused. You're stubborn. It's just practice, I said. I don't know how to be anything else. Good, she said. Then learn one more thing before midnight. What you owe and what you're owed. It changes the way your name sounds in your own mouth. I thought about that as I passed the bronze fisherman who had accumulated a scarf, someone's kindness draped around his metallic neck. I thought about it as the librarian rolled her cart of returns and a child held the door for her like a courtier. I thought about it as the light idled, then sharpened, the beam thin as a measure taken for a suit no one wanted to wear. At dusk, I took the cassette to the cannery one last time, threaded its tape past the heads, and rolled it in the big room. Empty rooms have a decency people seldom manage. They let things be heard without asking who said them. Julian's voice filled the cannery the way a tide fills a basin. When you hear yourself, don't turn around. Promise. Choose the knock. Film the light. Name the lie. I will, I said to his ghost, because sometimes you have to tell the dead you're going to disappoint them in public, and then do it correctly. When I left, Michael was standing on the seawall, half shadow, half request. He didn't look at me. Under's noisy with people who were never given a room to finish their sentences in, he said. You'd be surprised the stories that sink and keep talking. I don't think I would, I said. He smiled into the wind that kept trying to erase him and failing out of sheer lack of skill. You chose the breath, he said. Good. The lens belonged to the light too long. It gets ideas. You'll be there? Always, he said. And I knew he meant the kind of always that has geography and limits and still counts. It's not romance, I said. No, he said. It's worse and better. Midnight approached with the stealth of a professional. The town tucked itself in and peeked at the lighthouse through its blankets. I met Adrian by the steps with a small recorder and a microphone with a windscreen the size of a generous fruit. He had brought nothing that glowed, only things that admired air. "You ready?" he asked. "No," I said. "That's how I know I'm ready." We set up nothing that would make light admire us. We moved carefully enough to keep the steps green from resenting us. Elara came, because Elara always comes when a room intends to decide something. El stood back on the path, arms folded against the night as if bracing the town's spine. The librarian had the good sense to stay home or the kindness to pretend to. The anchor inn's cat watched from the railing, her kittens asleep in a pile of punctuation. I placed the microphone 3 steps down, just above where the tide had decided to pause for a beat. Adrian checked levels and did not lie to them. Elara did not stand in the taped square that wasn't here. She stood where the echo wanted its mirror. El nodded once, when our breath found a single rhythm, like 2 people who had learned to sleep in the same bed without stealing the blanket. The knock arrived, not on the door on the water, 3 soft thuds against the pilings, as if something old had decided to respect the ritual. We did not turn. The light, insulted, flung its beam hard across the harbor as if to tattoo us. We ignored it like adults who have learned not to reward bad behavior. "Name?" El called softly from the path. It was not a suggestion. "Quyen," I said, into the steps. The echo returned me with a different posture. Quyen, as if it were a question I had answered incorrectly, but with style. Then, between that and the next sweep of the beam, the breath. I heard it clean now, the room inhaling, deciding whether to be honest. Adrian heard it, his head tilted in the exact degree mine did. He nudged record. The meter breathed with us. Elara didn't sing. She made a single line of sound that would have been called a hum if anyone had wanted to insult it. The line bridged my name to the waters. The step held the weight of my vowels and did not complain. A voice came, not from below, not from behind, beside in that thin slice of air rooms leave when they expect a visitor. "Stay," it said again, that old command that could mean obedience or defiance, depending on who was using it. And then, "Say it." "Say what?" I asked, hating how much I had become the audience to my own life. "What you stole." I thought of the Hinge. I thought of the day I played his squeak in a reel that wasn't mine to touch. I thought of the time I pretended to be too busy to go to Greyhallow when he first invited me. How the truth was I was afraid of the echo and what it would repeat back to both of us. I thought of the time I told him I wanted to make films that made people cry because it felt like power, and how he had kissed my forehead like a priest. I stole time, I said. From him, I stole the moment I should have said yes. I stole his sound. I stole his room by turning it into a story. I stopped, because confession had become momentum, and momentum is a terrible editor. I stole the right to finish his sentence. The water did not thank me. It rarely does. The breath came again, a crisp yes divided by no coin flip. The knock repeated once, like applause a room gives itself when it has performed according to standard. The light raked across my shoulder and failed to move anything worth bragging about. "Give it back," the voice said. "How?" My hands were open. They held nothing. I thought of the blue ribbon sliding into water. I thought of the lens sleeping under a tarp like an old saint. I thought of the Hinge in Elle's kitchen, where it belonged. "Name the lie," Adrian whispered, not as a suggestion but as a line cue. "The light lies about direction," I said, "and I lie about intention. I pretend I filmed to tell the truth, but I want to be loved for it. I want their clicks to buy me forgiveness. I want to cut myself out and have them call me brave for it. The words tasted like metal. Good. Metal remembers. The breath came big, like a gust entering a church late. Then Julian's voice, not on tape, not inside wood on the line of air beside me, where you can feel the temperature change if you're stubborn enough to put your cheek there. You're allowed to want love, he said, with that intact tenderness that always made me suspect he had forgiven me ahead of schedule. Just don't edit the wound out. I won't, I said. I'll cut it on the breath. I felt Adrian's body relax, the way a good accompanist relaxes when the soloist has finally found the key they insisted didn't exist. Ilara's single note bent sweeter. Elle exhaled up on the path like a verdict. The water reached up, not a hand, not anything you could film and not have called cliché, just a lifting that shifted the air around our ankles. Something slid against my shoe, a small brass knock against rubber. I looked down, because the rule was, don't turn around. And this wasn't that. The hinge lay there, salt bright, its little screws intact, as if obedience merited return. I picked it up without ceremony and held it to the mic. Take it, I said to the steps. It's yours when you want it. Adrian recorded the room, laughing at us under its breath, as rooms do when people finally do the easy thing after performing difficulty for a while. The knock softened into the kind of sound houses make when weather changes. The light pretended to be sorry for the way it had been, then resumed its trade. We stayed until the tide had made new decisions. The recorder timed out, and Adrian restarted it with the patience of a man who has learned to wait without punishing anyone for it. Ilara eventually sat, then lay on the boards as if daring splinters to choose a better victim. Elle waited on the path like a judge who had already filed the verdict. When we finally rose, it wasn't triumph. It was the kind of fatigue you get after telling the truth well enough to let your body believe you. On the way back to the inn, Adrian slid his hand into mine. He did it in the old way, without fanfare, with complete accountability. He wasn't asking, he was telling some part of the night to make room for this, too. Don't trust the light, I said, because I am cruel when I am scared. I don't, he said. I trust your knock. Aid hef that aid him formant of am so nine saying. That sounds like a euphemism, I said, because I ruin things when they approach my mouth with too much sincerity. It's not, he said, amused. But it could be if you want. I laughed then, and it came out unpretty again, and therefore felt like a down payment on a future. We stopped at 2BL's hinge, and my pocket had weight. The door stuck a little, the weather changing its mind about joints, and I thought of how many times I had blamed inanimate things for refusing to admit the truth on command. Inside, the room exhaled, pleased to be included. I set the recorder on the table. Adrian leaned against the window frame and watched me the way a person watches a stage at the moment between house lights and curtain, when anything can still happen, and you choose to keep breathing anyway. Cut on the breath, he said softly, almost reverently. Cut on the breath, I said. Name the lie. And let the hinge be a hinge, he added, because men like him know how to sanctify the ordinary. We began to edit. The footage obeyed. The sound argued and then made concessions. I interleaved the cannery and the steps, the night and the breath, the song and the lack of it. I let the audience see the light's beauty and then hear it lie by mispointing their attention. I laid the breath like a spine. I put my confession where it belonged, and I did not dress it in violins. I let Julian's voice land not as a miracle, but as the stubborn evidence of a man who had known his work and loved me with the boring ferocity we never write enough about. Around 4 a.m., a storm fretted its way back into town. The window went silver with weather. We made another pot of coffee we could smell from the hallway. The anchor neon across the street flickered as if practicing failure. The kittens announced themselves, then curled into commas again. At 6, the room sighed in the way rooms do. When the light changes color, no judgment, just an opinion. We watched the export bar creep toward earnestly satisfying completion. I wanted to perform some ritual of restraint, to keep the film offline, to show it only to the sea, to let Greyhallow have its own secrets. I also wanted to feed the algorithm its most ethical meal. Both felt like lies of different sizes. "I'll premiere it here," I said, surprising myself. "Tonight, for the town. No thumbnails, no title that begs. Then I'll post it with the breath intact and the comments off for a day." "Comments off?" Adrian looked at me like I had put down a weapon. "Off," I said. "They can learn to talk in rooms instead of at screens for 24 hours. Whole day. And have the aid head ad follow." He nodded approval I had not known I needed. "Then sleep," he said. "We'll be worse later if we don't." I lay down on top of the fried egg bedspread and closed my eyes for what I told myself would be 2 minutes. Sleep came with its hands out like a cop. I let it frisk me. It found nothing I hadn't admitted to. I dreamed the Lark again. She stood between the 2 doors, modest bird with too big a choice. This time, when she moved, it wasn't a door she chose. It was the hinge. She perched there, ridiculous and sure, until the door she'd touched with her small weight swung open on its own and showed a meadow that did not demand a song to be believed. When I woke, the world had the crisp edges of a decision made. The lighthouse had gone pale with day. The hairs on my arm were trying to tell me something weather couldn't. The phone buzzed with a message from the unknown number. "Good. Premiere at dusk. Bring the hinge. Someone will try the other door." I looked at Adrian. He had fallen asleep sitting up, head tilted in that awkward angle only men and saints tolerate. I tugged a blanket over his shoulders. He opened his eyes and smiled with the innocent guilt of someone who had allowed himself to rest. "Dusk," I said. "Dusk," he said. We walked out into the town that had practiced all night to look like a place that had never learned anything difficult. The librarian stood at the cannery door with a clipboard, counting chairs. The woman with the bracelet strung a length of fairy lights that made the warehouse look like a reluctant garden. Elara carried nothing but a mouth, which is to say, she carried the most. Elle leaned against the wall with her braid tucked into her collar and her lighthouse in her pocket, the way some people carry their gods. "I've slotted you between dessert and denial," the librarian told me, deadpan. "Audience will be ripe." "Good," I said. "I've cut it on the breath." "Is why dis he was said wine." She smiled like a small secret, like a woman who remembers what milk tastes like before anybody buys it. By afternoon, people arrived as if summoned not by algorithm but by the knock of their neighbors' shoes on the boards. The cannery filled. Michael did not manifest, which is its own kind of integrity. The harbor pretended to behave. The light practiced not lying and failed, which is fine. Some jobs you don't ask people to change at the last minute. Dusk came. It always does. We dimmed the lights and then cut them. I stood in the aisle behind the last row and felt a town inhale. The knock came from the screen because we had taught it to. The breath came. The light lied beautifully. The room did not argue. Elara didn't sing. She let the film carry her voice, and she folded her arms and judges her past accurately. They watched. They didn't cough. They didn't perform their emotions for one another until the end, when we let them. When the breath landed and the cut followed it, somebody in the second row made a small sound like a door choosing not to be stubborn for once. When the film finished, we let the dark stand for 3 beats, the way you let silence tell the truth longer than anyone is comfortable with. Then the light came back up, this light. The rooms, not the liars. People looked at their hands and then at one another. A few cried without asking permission. A few nodded at the room, grateful in the old ways. A few left immediately to call someone they should have called yesterday. A shadow moved at the wall where the seam is. Someone reached for the other door. Elle's eyes snapped to it. Ilara stepped. Adrian's hand found mine without asking what its motives were. I felt the hinge in my pocket warm. "Don't," Elle said, not loudly, but with a keeper's authority. "Not yet." The shadow stilled. The other door, the one the light favors, waited with the patience of a lie that knows it will get its turn. "After," I said, surprising myself with the courage to be the person who says it. "After I answer the one question I owe, and more." I turned to the room I had made and the town that had made me, and said into the breath they were collectively about to take, "I loved him. I like him." I nodded toward the machines that had made the hinge sing and the man who knew how to hear it. Those are not mutually exclusive. But the story isn't a romance. It's a room. Thank you for letting me build it where you live. They breathed. I cut the moment in my head on the breath to save for later. From the seam, a second knock, not a warning, an invitation. The other door sighed as if insulted in a language it hadn't practiced. "Bring the hinge," the unknown number had said. I did. The Lark between two shadows. Chapter 5. The other door. The room moved like a creature deciding whether to show its teeth. The chairs scraped, the audience stood and didn't. The air took sides and then apologized for it. From the wall seam where the cannery kept its mistakes, the shadow swelled the way a bruise learns to be itself. The other door waited, patient as a patient liar. "Bring the hinge," the message had said. The hinge in my pocket warmed, as if reminded of its job by a language only brass speaks. Elle stepped forward without hurry, which is how authority performs itself honestly. The braid was tucked tight, hands empty, eyes on the seam. Ilara's jaw set at an angle I recognized from nights when she'd decided breath was optional. Adrian had my hand and then remembered to let it go, not because he didn't want to hold it, but because he did, and we had decided to be better than our impulses. I moved down the aisle, the film still a warmth in the room behind me, the echo of the breath still in people's throats. At the seam, the shadow shivered to take my shape and failed. Up close, the other door didn't look like a door. It looked like a tired place in the building where the carpenters had run out of certainty. That's what lies resemble up close. Fatigue pretending to be confidence. "What happens if it opens?" someone asked behind me. A woman, older, her voice braided out of fear and curiosity like a well-made rope. "The light will point," Elle said. "It's what it does. The room will gasp because it's polite. Some of you will go where you're pointed. Some of you will go where you intended to all along and pretend the light convinced you. Someone will be left to shut it." She looked at me as if I'd come to town to learn that particular employment. "Ilara," I said, not turning because I had learned my one trick, and I intended to use it, "sing the lock." She laughed, a sharp sound that could cut rope if needed. "I don't sing for hardware," she said, but her mouth softened. "I sing for rooms, and then sing for this one," I said. "It's asking." Her hum started as a refusal and turned into a permission. She placed a vowel on the seam that made the shadow lean back, offended. I took the hinge from my pocket and held it up like a coronation in miniature. The screws winked like conspirators. The seam was not wood. It was a habit. Hinge meets habit like any ritual. Slowly, then all at once. Adrian was there at my shoulder before I could ask, palm open for tool that wasn't there. L slipped a stubby screwdriver into his hand without looking. The keeper's kit is always within reach. "You sure?" he breathed, eyes on mine for once, not on meters. "No," I said, "that's how I know it's ours to do." The sentence had become my prayer. The first screw bit. The seam complained in the language of old paint, a dry flake of protest on my knuckle. Ilara's lock song settled lower, as if trying to convince the floor to remember why it had ever agreed to be horizontal. The audience became furniture again, good furniture, quiet, solid, allowing weight. "Left," Elle said softly, and we all understood the new meaning. Not direction, not politics, not verb leave as in let go, left as in remainder, as in what stays when you subtract the romantic, the thriller, the algorithm, the light. We were down to hinge and breath. The second screw turned and took its oath. The hinge lay flat where two planes refused to meet unless coaxed into honesty. The shadow at the seam tried to be a hand and failed, tried to be a mouth and failed. Adrian's shoulder brushed mine. The air around us took on that spark-scent rooms exhale when two metals commit to touching. "Why a hinge?" the older woman asked again, not to be difficult, but because the mind asks twice when the heart is busy. "Because doors need a way to move without breaking," Elle said. "And because when rooms love people, they need something to forgive themselves with." She looked satisfied that she had found the sentence in time to save us. The last screw snugged home and the hinge settled into purpose like a lark onto a wire it mistook for a branch. The seam stilled, the other door sighed, insulted. Ilara's note tilted toward triumph and then refused to arrive because she is a professional. The room exhaled. The light denied its spectacle, did what all prima donnas do when the chorus wins. It pretended it had planned it all along and swept the far wall with a flourish meant for a different scene. People remembered their bodies. A cough auditioned for a role. The librarian, clipboard under her arm like a shield, gave me a look that said, "Now the work begins." I pressed my palm flat against the hinge, warm, ordinary. "Stay," I said to the seam. It didn't answer because doors do not need encouragement the way people do. They require maintenance, which is almost the same thing if you do it regularly. From behind us, a knock. Not the water's, not the light's flesh, on wood, polite and actual. Everyone turned except me. I didn't because stubbornness had become my superstition. Footsteps came down the side aisle, not stealthy, not performative. Michael stepped into the light that was not lying. He had put on a clean shirt someone had ironed grief out of. He nodded at Elle with the practical respect of a man who has learned to trust the person who writes the tide tables for the town's behavior. "I figured you'd choose to keep it shut," he said, to me but also to the room. "You're better at open than most, but open can be a lie too." "I thought you'd be under," I said. "I am," he said cheerfully, and tapped his chest. "The part you can see is the export." He glanced at Adrian with the indulgence of an older brother toward a younger man trying not to misuse a beautiful machine. "You kept the breath." Adrian nodded, flushed in the way men do when praised by someone whose jurisdiction includes something bigger than meters. "We cut on it." "Good," Michael said. You'll have to. From here on out, people will come to make the room lie. Hinge it when you need to. Unhinge it when it's safe. The advice wasn't dramatic enough to trend. It was the kind you tie a life to. He stepped back then, attention passing over the audience with the blessed indifference of someone who had stopped auditioning for other people's forgiveness. He lifted 2 fingers, goodbye or salute, both can be true, and slid sideways into the seam which no longer offered performance, only maintenance. The hinge did not complain. That's not its job. Applause tried to start, remembered we had dodged sentimentality on purpose, and settled for a murmur of assent. The librarian clapped once official business, then tucked her hands away. I stood there with my palm on the new metal and felt the ridiculous, holy fatigue of having done the smallest hard thing properly. Elle came close enough to be advice but not touch. "You'll be tempted now," she said. "All the easy lies have older sisters." "Like what?" I asked, heart obediently speeding up at the scent of future failure. "Like making this about your courage," she said, "or making it about love, or saying the room healed you because the edit went well. Rooms do not heal, they correct posture." She smiled. "Healing is a side effect of not slouching in front of the truth." "I'll write that on a napkin," I said. "Then I'll lose the napkin at the diner and hope the waitress memorizes it." "You won't have to," she said. "Greyhallow keeps what it keeps." She nodded at the hinge. "And now it keeps this." After, people came up with their gratitude shaped like questions and their questions shaped like apologies. A man with a fisherman's hand squeezed mine and said his brother had drowned the year the price of diesel went up, as if the sea adjusts itself to commodity markets. A girl with hair dyed the exact blue of the dress asked if she could learn the Lark song. Elara said no and yes in the same syllable, and the girl understood and was not offended. The woman with the bracelets told me the kittens had been named Coin and Breath. When the room emptied, it was even more itself. Empty rooms are a kindness. They do not require you to perform small talk. Adrian and I coiled cables like conclusions. Elara leaned against the pallets, smoking and looking at the new hinge with the complex affection of a person who admires a solution she would never have chosen. Elle checked the screws with a small tug that would have embarrassed any lesser hardware. The unknown number texted, "Of course it did. Thank you." I typed, "Who are you?" and set the phone on the crate as if time could be persuaded to travel the long way. The reply took its privacy and then arrived. "Houses, water. The part of you that insists on a cut you can live with," it added, with a sudden humanity that felt like a friend squeezing your shoulder when a joke would do harm. "Get some sleep." We didn't, not right away. Adrian and I walked the harbor. The light swept and we let it, without letting it choose for us. A fog came on cat feet, because cliches are efficient when they're true. He told me a story about the first sound he fell in love with, a piano bench creak that keeps time better than the metronome because it cares. I told him a story about my mother teaching me to listen to chopsticks tapping bowls to know which aunt was in the kitchen. We became people again, not just devices. "Will you go back?" he asked finally, meaning my city, my channel, the stream that eats what you feed it and asks for dessert. "Yes," I said. With this, cut on the breath, comments off for a day and maybe forever some days, knocked louder than the light. He looked relieved and a little ridiculous, which is to say, he looked like a person you could love without making it your job. "And us? Nothing that needs the light," I said. "Everything that trusts the knock." I put my hand in his then, not to be filmed, not to perform, but to teach my body to keep the promise my mouth had just made. He squeezed once, a punctuation, and let go, as if to prove that holding is better when you don't force it. The last thing we did that night was go to the steps, because rituals need a second performance to decide they're not mistakes. The tide had learned a slower word. The board smelled like good endings. I put my mouth to the air beside mine and said, "Thank you." To Julian, to Michael, to rooms, to old carpenters and young gulls, to hinges that understand metaphor. The echo returned your welcome in 3 accents, and I believed all of them. In the days that followed, the film went where films go. It did not explode. It seeped. It found the people who wake with unspent apologies in their mouths and offered them a room to practice forgiveness in without applause. The algorithm harumphed and then, unable to resist a hinge well-oiled, allowed it wild. People wrote me 3 kinds of letters. I am sorry. I am alive. I heard it. I let some of them be published because I had chosen for once not to be afraid of rooms that don't belong to me. We screened it in towns that had forgotten they were ports. We screened it in rooms with bad acoustics and made those rooms feel shame until they improved. We screened it to teenagers who pretended to be bored and then went home and listened to the stairwells in their apartment buildings until the walls admitted they knew their names. Greyhallow remained itself. That is the highest compliment you can pay a place, Elara sang, when she felt like scaring the town into honesty and didn't when it didn't deserve the gift. She and Michael conducted their strange, precise, under-above choreography without asking permission. The librarian learned to love a hinge more than a book spine. The woman with the bracelets added, "No exceptions for the triumphant," under the kitten sign, and laughed every time she had to explain it. Elle kept the light honest, which is to say, she polished it and then taught us where not to look. She invited me up sometimes to stand on the breath spot and listen to the sea mispronounce my name in a way that made me fonder of it, as if affection were simply a tolerance for error well meant. Adrian and I did not become the kind of couple you can narrate without lying. We didn't move in, we didn't move apart. We traveled rooms together and apart, and the rooms learned to say both our names without gossip. When we fought, we cut on the breath. When we kissed, we didn't trust the light. When we recorded, we left the hinge alone unless it asked for help. Months later, when the town had absorbed our interference and resumed its posture, I returned alone on a weekday that had not asked to be special. The pier boards knew my weight. The bronze fisherman had lost his scarf to a new season's vanity. I walked to the steps and lay my palm on the second wettest, my favorite, a superstition I admitted to only when no one was recording. I kept it, I said to no one, the promise, the cut, the hinge. The echo returned, the single most boring and therefore most satisfying word in the language. Good. I turned then not against advice but with it, because sometimes obedience becomes bravado and needs correcting. There was no ghost, no man in the seam. There was a blue ribbon caught on a nail, bleached to prudence by sun and salt. I took it, not like a souvenir, but like a receipt. I tied it around the hinge in Elle's kitchen and left it there when she wasn't home, because gratitude likes to pretend it doesn't want witnesses. At the Anchor Inn, coin and breath had become cats, as creatures insist on doing. The woman with the bracelets told me a story about a storm that had got lost and had to be walked back to the ocean like a drunk friend. She slid a napkin toward me without ceremony. Cut on the breath, it read. Blocked letters, underlined, trust the knock, name the lie. Below, in a different hand, smaller, almost shy. Leave room for the room. Who wrote the last line? I asked. Rooms, she said, and winked in a way that made me suspect she'd been the unknown number when the rooms were busy. I walked the town one more time and let it fail to be symbolic. That is the mercy of places. The lighthouse counted, the gulls negotiated, the diner overcooked, the library remembered, the cannery hummed the new timber rooms get after they've been made to keep their promises in public. The hinge on the seam glowed the way good brass does when it has nothing left to prove. That night, alone in 2B, I dreamed the Lark again, because our obsessions pay rent reliably. 2 doors, same meadow, same owl, that history insists on inserting into other people's metaphors. The Lark hopped between shadows, unconvinced. She tilted her small head and listened. The light wrote its persuasive line across one door. The knock, honest as an unpaid bill, tapped behind the other. The Lark ignored both for a second, the hardest thing, and listened for the breath. She heard it. She flew to the hinge. She perched there until the door decided what it wanted to be, and when it moved, it didn't do it because light told it to, or knock dared it to. It moved because breath too fast to lie, too quick to perform had told it. Now, I woke with the lighthouse writing softly on the ceiling, and my mouth tasting of brass and salt and something sweeter I don't have a right word for. I could tell you it was closure. It wasn't. We don't get that much, and when we do, we spend it too fast. It was maintenance. The small, unshowy promise to keep the hinge oiled, to polish the lens without letting it choose for me, to put my ear to the wall and not flinch when the room cleared its throat. Morning burned the fog off like a fact asserting itself. I packed the camera, the recorder, the coil of cable that behaves if you speak to it correctly. On my way out, I pressed my palm to the hinge in the kitchen and felt nothing miraculous. A smoothness, a warmth from sunlight, a whisper of friction doing its job. Good. Miracles make me lazy. At the door, Elle handed me a paper bag with a wedge of bread and a hard cheese, the color of a careful sunset. For the train, she said, and a different hinge. She pressed a small, weighty parcel into my other hand. I unwrapped it to find a new brass hinge, unblemished, unstoried. She shrugged. You'll need one. People always do. Better to be ready than to pry one off a door that's trying its best. I tucked it into the pocket where the ribbon used to live. I'll pay you, I said. You already did, she said. You kept the breath in. At the station, the bench shared my weight without comment. The train arrived with the righteous sigh of machines that believe in schedules. I boarded, took a window, watched Greyhallow slide itself out of the frame without insisting on a last line. My phone pinged once with a message I did not need but loved anyway. Stay. I wrote back, I will, and then, for the first time since I'd started filming grief for strangers and consequently myself, turned the phone off before the tunnel. Out the window, the sea pretended to forget us and did not. The light lay on the water like a rumor. The breath, this is the part you can't film, threaded itself between my ribs and settled there with the ordinary confidence of good craft. Back in the city, I made rooms, not bigger or louder, just better. I cut on the breath and named the lie. I let the hinge be a hinge. I trusted knocks that did not flatter me. When people asked on panels and in comments what the secret was, I said something true that would not help them if all they wanted was metrics. The truth is too fast to perform. Make space for it. Some wrote it down. Some rolled their eyes. Some went home and listened at their own doors in the dark and learned to hear when rooms inhale. At night, sometimes, Adrian would send a file with no subject line, 30 seconds of silence that wasn't a stairwell's opinion, a river's grammar under a bridge, a sleeping cat's thesis. I'd send back a hinge I'd recorded, closing properly on a cabinet, and get an amen in return. Alara dropped a postcard once, no words, just a swath of blue paint and a cigarette burn. Michael sent nothing, which is exactly right. I don't have an epilogue you can feed to a platform. I have a practice. When I choose the knock and film the light and hold the hinge in my pocket until the room asks for it. When I hear myself, I don't turn around unless the breath tells me to. When I'm told stay, I ask where. Sometimes the answer is a person. Sometimes it's a town. Sometimes it is the quieter room inside the louder one, the one without the stage. In that room, the lark doesn't have to sing. She can if she wants. She can hop from hinge to hinge and not apologize for where she lands. Between two shadows, she has learned the trick we never taught her, and she never owed us. She listens first, then she flies.